exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate, learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the...
Broadcast from later, Macy, Valdez, Udit, me, Robert, and Matthew Leavitt, a PhD in computational neuroscience who recently completed his AI residency at FAIR. Weak signals are stuff we notice and suspect could mean significant changes underway. This is where we try to make sense of stuff we know nothing about, and you're welcome to watch. Valdez, what's your weakest signal?
So there's like a blog post about this idea of a visual revolution in knowledge work that's occurred like over the course of COVID, but much longer, based on the availability of real-time visual collaboration tools, specifically Miro and Figma, which I think a lot of people who work in some kind of like knowledge industry, which is technically every industry, but like just for the sake of clarity is like the kind of stuff that we work in, which is like a doc worker, you know, like making Word documents and slide decks and wireframes and digital paper pushing. But the thing that was interesting is that this person, Tom Critchlaw, who's like an indie consultant of a kind, who's part of the Venn Rao community and whatnot, is talking about how this shift to like Figma and Miro replacing slides and Google Docs is actually not just a matter of like a virtual whiteboard or a democratized design kind of idea, but it's actually like a foundational shift in how knowledge is organized and how collaboration occurs. And the way he frames it, which I thought was quite nice, maybe we can unpack whether it's interesting or whether it's just like a really good marketing, is like that it's a shift from documents to canvases.
Wow.
You know? And
Cool.
I was like, ooh, it's very well framed or spoken of. I'm curious if like that notion resonates like with how we go about working. And it's interesting because like I've started, just as an example, I've started using Miro in ways where I'll like import whole PDFs and just outline them in like splay them like flat inside of a document, canvas rather. To me, it's much more closer to something like doodling than anything in slides or docs was able to do. Like for the first time, I can actually just draw lines between slides that are like 20 slides away. You know, once you see it all in a single space, in terms of like editing and whatnot, it totally transforms how you go about doing it. Like the closest equivalent is sort of like actually printing it out and being able to, you know, put it on a board or walk all over it. But the kinds of shifts in how you can actually chunk information and have it be much more, be almost like fractal, like there's ways that you can kind of like create multiple perspectives on the same piece of knowledge is much more easier in something like a canvas than it is in a slide document or a PDF or a Word document. So that's the idea, from documents to canvases, and how that shifts what knowledge work is and does.
Let's talk more about what a canvas is first. Like, what do you think that, I question if it's the right word, but I mean, I think I get what is meant in this context, but what do you think, like, what do you think is canvas like about it?
It's infinitely big. Sort of, there's like this zoomability. We don't have to define infinity.
But it's like more spatial or something, right? Things
operate at different scales. You can have multi-scalar sort of relationships between pieces in a document. And this happens naturally. I don't know if it was with us who we were talking about this, but like, and I'm sorry, Matthew, if this is like not relevant to anything you do.
No, this is super interesting. I actually wrote down a bunch of ideas, and I'm also very curious what your guys' thoughts on this are. So I
don't know if it was just something that people who work in like slide documents all the time like deal with, you know, it's just like the nightmare.
Most of science is either communicated through PDFs or through slide decks. So like this is extremely relevant to, you know, even like technical scientific communication, which is very, very medium constrained. So it is relevant, but please continue.
As a document that you work in, like with a group, builds over time, different sections start becoming like different sizes, and you can lose where you started because for some reason you're using like 12 font there, but now you're up to like 36 and it's just accidental, but it kind of like there's a piece of knowledge embedded in that relationship, you know? It's kind of like a function between these two pieces of information is based on the size of the font and how that occurred and whatnot. That's what makes it a canvas, is like without having a grid structure, without having constraints on space, without having it all have the same kind of sizing, you can create different almost like functions between pieces of data and whatnot, visual functions, at least visual relationships.
I was thinking about like a lot of the work that I do and what goes into the process, and articulated it recently as creating a dashboard with everything you need to know and only so much as you need to know, and kind of getting that right. So even if I'm writing, it's like I've got a cluster of words and bits of writing that I'm kind of constantly pulling to like fit on roughly a screen in some kind of manageable amount to like cut back to or whatever. Yeah, it's like a Word doc. I find myself doing this in a Word document, even if it's not the best tool to do it, but sort of what do I need to, what's the information I need to be able to get where I'm going, and how kind of close can I keep it? And that's like the kind of management of even tabs and things like that, like managing how many tabs are open and not, like when does it become useless to have that many tabs open, and when is it helpful to have 7 or something open that you might be referring back to.
The great thing about a doc, though, is that it forces like a linearity, right? It's because like there's an order, right? You're going from like top to bottom. So if you're trying to build a narrative or an argument, I think it's better than like a non-linear canvas, like Miro or Figma, or whatever. I think Miro is really good for like just laying out all the puzzle pieces, like trying to understand what you're working with, which is what you're saying, Rob, that you do.
Yeah, well, it's a part of like while you're working, right? Like not these things, Microsoft Word, it's a publishing thing rather than like a process of writing thing. And that was always like, I always liked Scrivener better.
Yeah, which does that.
But it's more writing than it is publishing. Yeah. And
Yeah,
you
so
can reference.
I'm just wondering though now is the shift that there is more acceptance to present in this way, where there is not necessarily like a linearity or a like point to point narrative to how you are presenting the material, but it's almost like let the audience explore.
I think it's definitely there. I think people are publishing their Miro boards and Figma boards a lot more than I've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm.
There's a drafty bias to Miro boards, you know, they're always like works in progress. They're never completed the way that a document often feels kind of complete. But the other thing, Macy, that at least Tom brings up in this piece is the idea that like actually the way teams collaborate changes with Miro, where all of a sudden you can have design and engineering and I guess product managers do kind of a little bit of everything, but you can kind of have everybody on one board together. It's almost like a visual Kanban, except like the purpose isn't like a Kanban style to allocate tasks. It's just to see where different components are at and whatnot. And you can give more feedback to the design process in like an ongoing way, rather than it, you know, occurring at the end of a sprint or something like that.
Yeah, because you can kind of like carve out the visual real estate a little bit on the canvas and say, okay, this part is like this team. So while you're all kind of working separate, you're also in the same space, which is much harder to do in a document, I think.
Do you think that part of the appeal is that there is not a pressure to sort of have a official release, like because there's sort of a drafty quality to something, like people feel, you know, sort of less pressure to have like some finality or like a deadline and have things sort of presented in a clean, like final published document, as opposed to just like, oh, here are my ideas, you know, take them as they are. And that sort of makes it much easier on the part of the like sort of creator. Yeah, there's just like less pressure on them.
I mean, my own take on that question is the way that tools actually get taken up by people. So something like Google Slides, like there's so many ways that you can use it. And I recently started just like laying out documents the way that you would use something like InDesign to do, like basically to almost construct like a book or something like that. And I never used it that way, but I was like, why is the default the 16:9 landscape style? Obviously, because screens and stuff are that same size and whatnot, but like there's so many other ways you could use this tool. So like to me, the question that you brought up around like draftiness and Miro, one part of the way I'm like wondering is like, does that become a default for kind of work that is a little sloppier or something like that, that like we don't take the time to actually linearly work through exactly the narrative that we want, and everything's always just, you know, like up to other people to interpret. It's the mood board version of thinking or something, you know?
I guess Miro allows for both. So you can essentially create a sequence where there are slides, but then you can have a space where everyone is contributing and it's very, very messy. And you can delineate that space yourself. So maybe that's a bit of the shift, is that it's allowing for both, and you're able to do it digitally and collaborate with people remotely in that way.
I mean, there's certain things that if you try to linearize, you lose, and you're actually compressing the information and you're losing some information as well. And I think there are like, especially where you cannot draw like very strict causal relationships, like it's better to actually represent ideas in a flat, nonlinear way, I think. So I think there is a fundamental shift because you can present these ideas digitally and collaboratively and across the internet in a nonlinear way.
And in a different visual way too. Like I was on like a workshop this morning where I just started like sketching stuff visually, like during the session, and it was so helpful. It's like I've done that in Google Docs and stuff before, but that draw tool is awful. So
how do you do it in Google Docs? Wow, good job.
Yeah, it's terrible.
I still find myself wanting to draw on paper though. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah.
There's no substitute thus far.
Agreed. But if somehow there were a way to have the tactile quality of paper infinity, I could like that too.
Yeah, that's why I feel like haptics are like the, low-key hero to like what will end up, my vision of like the sort of truly bridging the digital divide, because like that is the thing that is hardest to do because it's necessarily physical. So like tech people don't want anything to do with it. And like it's, it just requires like precision mechanics and a lot of resource intensive investment. But like it seems like there's like consensus, like, yeah, it just doesn't feel right. And like that's such a limiting factor. So it does seem like being able to find solutions for the haptics part will be like very important for getting like that sort of like casual idea expression that comes in like doodling or, just like sort of unstructured note taking on a piece of paper.
I couldn't help but think if like the main factors we're talking about are the multi-scalar spatial thing, then like is the logical next thing to talk about
VR.
Doing this in VR. Yeah. And collaborative work environments of that sort, which like I'm like so practically skeptical, but like love the fantasy of that sort of thing, just because it's not there yet. And like, yeah, haptics do seem like they would be the hero, as you put it.
So with this, I guess the claim is that like this isn't just a change in tooling. This is like a change in the fundamental way in which knowledge work is being performed and communicated. Like I feel like that's sort of a false dichotomy. Like I feel like tools necessarily like structure the ways we interact and think about the things we're doing. Like they are defined by their affordances. So a change in tooling is going to necessarily create a change in the way we think about and understand things. Like I feel like I'm maybe a little bit of an extremist in this viewpoint, but like I do think presenting those things as opposed is a little bit of a red herring, which if anything, I don't know, I feel like bolsters the point of that this individual is trying to make, but also I'm very curious for you all's thoughts on this because maybe I'm in an echo chamber.
You haven't listened to business strategy gurus enough where nothing can be proclaimed unless it's a revolution that has fundamentally transformed everything and reset history once and for all. It's a continuation of the French Revolution mindset, year zero.
So you almost need a straw man, like you need a, something to represent like an outmoded way of doing something so that you can present what is, happening now as a revolution with regards to that.
Yeah. Rough. I mean, that's rough. There's so many complicating factors, but yeah, exactly. Like something along those lines. There's something about that narrative style that just gives you a certain kind of cachet on people's attention and drives their interest and energy. There's probably darker stuff around like what that says about how people in business see sort of deeper rooted historical trends and whatnot, and their ability to kind of just overcome them. But that's like a slightly different topic.
That is extremely interesting. And also the type of, I think, sort of like professional and cultural knowledge that as someone who does not work in the same domain as you guys, I'm not familiar with or have access to. And so that is extremely interesting to hear. It does seem like another instance of the way in which like the communication of all human pursuits is fundamentally comes down to like an issue of narrative and framing, as opposed to necessarily like more than, or at least as important as the sort of underlying ideas. But yeah, the way in which I think that manifests is consistently interesting across sort of different cultures. And maybe I'm going to go on a limb here and use some lingo that I do not get to use in my day-to-day life across different verticals.
Right.
You nailed it.
Matt, what are your thoughts about VR in general, actually?
Somewhat complicated, I guess. I mean, I think like as with most things, it is oversold. And why are we moving on to a virtual world if we cannot get the sort of meat space dynamics and like incentives and stuff right? But like on the other hand, I do think it is like the interactions still sort of are very impoverished in a sensory sense. Like you can see and like, it is visually immersive, but it is not particularly immersive in any other sensory domain, I think, which is a big problem. And like humans always have we like really privileged sight at the expense of other senses, which is fair because like we rely on it a lot and stuff. But like, I do think it sort of hamstrings our ability to, sort of like succeed or really make meaningful experiences and technologies. But maybe a better way to frame this is like long-term versus short-term. Like it's basically, I think it is a long-term viable prospect. Like I think it's like a more in the realm of like a basic science where there's a lot of fundamental work that needs to be done and like problems that need to be solved for it to be promising, but the potential utility of it is substantial enough that that is a worthwhile sort of long-term project to pursue. But I think in terms of like the next 5 years, I don't think it's going to have like a monumental shift on the way we live or interact on a sort of shorter commercially relevant time frame, which is not to say that commercial relevance isn't a useful incentive to like motivate work in it.
It's a long-term project, yeah.
Yes.
What do you think the interface is like for actually convincing multi-sensory virtual reality? Let's say like go as far in the future as you want.
Yeah, that's a really good question. But yeah, what I'm providing is like unaccountable speculation.
That's my favorite kind of speculation.
So like the visual stuff seems to be like pretty well done, except for the issue of motion sickness, which basically like immediately cuts off like 20% of people from participating in it. You know, that's a big hurdle, but like in one sense, it's sort of like, you know, most of the way there. In another sense, it is not. I think audio isn't super hard. It shouldn't be too hard to sort of get personalized profiles of like what people's ears are shaped like so that sound can be dynamically adjusted to appear like spatialized. Like there's already generic models that are pretty good for that. I think, as I sort of mentioned before, haptics is the big thing, like sensation. Like we rely so heavily on our, you know, vestibular sense for balance and motion and proprioception for feeling embodied in our sense of interaction in space. And those are things that seem very difficult to simulate to me. Those seem like the big hurdles. Like, and so if there were a way of doing non-invasive brain or like a neural stimulation for that, that could potentially solve that problem. But also that's like really hard because you basically need like very fine stimulation of either like your brain or some difficult to access like organs or nerves. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's actually really easy to make people see Halle Berry. Spent, you know, billions of dollars in 20 years, instead of just showing a picture of Halle Berry, you just go into the brain and, you know, find and stimulate the Halle Berry neuron. And honestly, sometimes that's what it feels like. Like people don't want to just show someone a picture of Halle Berry because they somehow feel like it would be more like pure or like a bigger technological leap to make them see Halle Berry by like stimulating the Halle Berry neuron. You know, putting aside that like the Halle Berry neuron might not even be a thing, but that like somehow, yeah, it's like, well, why don't you just show them the picture? It's like, well, then, because that wouldn't be a big technological leap. It's like, yeah, but you solve the problem in a way that doesn't require like cutting open someone's skull and like putting it anyway. More realistically, like probably gloves that can provide like high acuity haptic feedback, because being able to use our hands and interact with things sort of digitally and like, you know, sort of the like silly Iron Man demo where he's like doing the CAD stuff, like, yeah, that's a stupid Hollywood idea, but like I think fundamentally like that's one of the most powerful ways in which VR could work is you use our like very high acuity tactile sensors to be able to shape non-physical forms and sort of ideas in a way that you could typically only do with like clay and, you know, physical materials.
Do people think that's going to rewire people's neurobiology fundamentally if you start doing that a lot?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I feel like there's always...
you know, like the bicycle experiment where they like the Dutch bicycles where you kind of pedaling is the opposite direction, and people who like learn how to bike that way, it actually changes. Well, this is something I've heard, that it changes your neurobiology, and you cannot bike the other way for at least for a while, but you can unlearn and relearn. And I just wonder what the sort of ethical implications are for changing your biology by doing something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like the sort of annoying answer to that is like everything changes your biology, like just the way you live structures your brain necessarily. But I do think there's sort of an interesting push-pull there, which is like, what's the right trade-off between something being intuitive and something requiring some amount of learning? Intuition and making like intuitive interfaces and like intuitive design is like a very big, at least to me, I'm not a designer though, so I'd be very curious for your guys' thoughts on this because you're a lot more experienced in this domain, that like that seems to be very like privileged and incentivized, but like most sort of meaningful, expressive and powerful things require learning and like sometimes even, you know, like training to be able to understand and make the most use of. So I do feel like, yeah, there's sort of always a trade-off there between like, you know, how much plasticity is required on behalf of the person versus on behalf of the like object or interface.
That makes sense. I mean, I think we recently talked about the abacus versus the calculator idea, which is the same concept, where one like makes you think about a tool very differently, whereas one is just a tool for convenience.
Although I don't know, like maybe if a calculator, like you could sort of see the actual bits and what was happening with the bits and the operations in them as you were using the calculator, like maybe that would get people to understand mathematics in a, you know, way that like the abacus, yeah, like basically, well,
binary representation.
Yeah, and maybe the big distinction there is that in one of those systems you can see its mechanics, and in one of them you cannot. Like basically like a closed versus a like
open system.
Yeah.
Makes me think of how inches and like everyone always like shits on the imperial system for being like irrational and whatever, but actually it's so much more intuitive for humans because it's based on human scale measures, right? Inches, feet, miles. For some reason, these are like miles, almost like roughly what you can see. There's something much more intuitive to them. Like I find that when I want to eyeball something, I mean, doing it in centimeters is crazy. It doesn't make any sense. Like it's so much easier to just eyeball something in inches, right? And everyone always makes fun of it. But
do you not use decimeters? No, nobody does. Despite like that's the one that's on the human scale, but like no one uses.
And I mean, thinking about the height of a human being and anything other than feet and inches doesn't really.
But you also have 10 digits of this, which is like, you know, the core fundamental idea behind the metric system, is that the changes in scale happen in multiplications of 10.
Yeah. The Sumerians had like a base 60 or something numbering system. And I think it had something to do with like moon cycles. It's like, it's not just the human body. It's like all sorts of things in the environment that might, you know, based on a particular problem that you're trying to address. I think that answer is true. You know, like our knowledge about the universe is very much based on what we want to do with it. Like what we're trying to understand. I don't know. We're like so off topic, but I had one more thing I wanted to say, like just in response to the question of like how you frame sensing and immersion. And I was just thinking about how I wonder if part of the problem is that we frame sensing as though it's like sensing and immersion as though it's a technical problem. We just need to get high enough resolution in the particular things that currently we're not having any sensing interaction with. So tactile in particular. And what I was thinking was just like, to me, like, a book is like an incredibly immersive experience, and actually it's very bodily. And so like when you read words like run, your body's mirror neurons are kicking your body into sort of an anticipatory running state. So you're actually like, it is tactile in the sense that your body is transforming itself internally as you read, and it's entirely immersive. And film to me is quite similar. It's operating on visual and it's doing something different because it's doing both of them together. But it's also very tactile. Your body does a lot of things in reaction to it. It cries, it screams, it ducks, you know, it's very immersive.
I'm always annoyed by the like claims by people who are putting VR poverty tourism experiences together and saying like it helps you with your empathy or something. And it's like reading novels helps you with your empathy.
Empathy is just the bandwidth question of how much sensory data you can send across the tube.
Yeah. So I was listening to an interview with Chris Rock, who apparently has like a new horror movie coming out, and was making the point that like why that genre is so exciting is because it's the only genre when you hear someone going up the steps, you think they're in the same space as you. And so there's like these effects that come through different like genres even that create immersive like virtual reality kind of experiences. And I'd never thought about that. I was like, oh, that is a very cool justification for why this genre like matters particularly.
That's also super interesting because I feel like it indicates that maybe for VR, that would be like a very enticing proof of concept.
I have to jump back for 1 second on the explainability and the abacus question. Explainability, just because you brought it up before we started this on your work. Could you conceive of a situation like what you were describing with that calculator where we would be learning from machine learning in a sort of like everyday use case, I guess, if it were more abacus-like, or there was more explainability visualized somehow that you could like understand what's going on, but actually to build your own cognitive abilities?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have ever been on Distill. It's a machine learning research publication that is entirely digital, and it is sort of highly interactive and dynamic and designed to escape scientific communication, basically being a paper like simulator. And so it's sort of designed to be very explorable. And a lot of the work it's done is in explainability. And specifically, it's like allowing you to basically like turn different knobs and like take out different modules from neural networks to understand how they work and what they're doing. And that is very much, I think, a change from like static serial paper presentation style to in this case, it's like, it's not just a canvas, it's like a dynamic canvas. I mean, I guess doesn't have like a ton of, like, you can't sort of create with it or like contribute to it. Like it's still sort of a product being output. But that is very much in line with this sort of change in the way creation and communication is happening. And like machine learning researchers being motivated to like learn JavaScript so they can use D3 so they can convey their research in a dynamic, interactable way. I mean, you could extend this to VR, like instead of just being graphics on a page, like you could add, because like that's still sort of like a fairly narrow bandwidth medium. Like if you could actually, like there was a spatial component, like a sort of geospatial component to the way information was laid out, you could have a sort of much richer interactions with the system to try and understand it. Like that, I think would be a super cool use of VR for understanding and exploring complex systems.
Cool. Signal or noise? Noted?
I think
Remember what we were talking about?
Yeah. We were talking about canvases versus documents.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely signal. I also like what Matt was just saying reminded me of other kind of parallel examples also of this sort of like interactive dynamic canvas type ideas. One of which is REPL. Do you guys know REPL? So REPL stands for read, evaluate, print loop, which is like a thing. It's like a way you interact with computers where you like, when you work with a terminal where you
say
like,
it one more time. Sorry.
REPL.
Yeah, and
REPL means read, evaluate, print loop.
Okay.
Which is like a way you interact with a terminal where you like type a program and you like have this sort of dynamic two-way interaction with your terminal to like give it an instruction and get the evaluation right away. And then you can give it the next command or whatever.
Yeah.
But there are all these like, now there are these like essentially REPL apps, which are essentially like canvases where you write this code and you publish it and you can see it dynamically changing as an app live. And REPL is a website also, which is like basically taking this idea of REPLs and making it kind of available to everybody to build these sort of like dynamic applications live, which is cool. Anyway, it's a signal to me.
Matthew, signal or noise?
I certainly think it is signal. Like I said, I think like maybe the dichotomy between like change in tools versus change in understanding is noise, but certainly think there's signal here.
Macy, signal or noise?
I think it's a signal towards different ways of working or embracing dynamic collaboration, real-time collaboration in different ways. The REPL you were talking about, it reminds me of Etherpad a little bit too. And in that case, it's interesting because it's a document, it's a text-based interface, but it's a collaborative real-time editor. And so everyone can edit at the same time, but you're able to see linearity throughout. There's a scroll bar where you can see how the document has changed. And I guess in some ways that is like a Google Doc, but there is just like a different type of interaction to it, which lends itself also to kind of a canvas because there is that embrace of like the messiness and the chaos, but then it also allows for presentability in the end. So I think it's kind of working towards like a hybrid model.
You can like turn up and down the like layers of the columns. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's a signal, but I don't think it's a canvas. My first one. Udit, what's your weakest signal?
My weakest signal is this company called Urchinomics, which is a sea urchin harvesting company. Essentially, in the last few years, there's this explosion of purple sea urchins off the coast of California. And these divers have been calling it the purple carpet because there are all these purple sea urchins at the bottom of the ocean. And the reason why they've exploded is because essentially global warming. So the water temperature has risen, which has made it more habitable for these sea urchins, these specific sea urchins called purple urchins. And also their natural predator, which are these sunflower sea stars, had a large scale die off in the last decade because of some disease. But the main outcome of this is that these sea urchins don't have any predators, and this like part of the coast of California is like extremely habitable for them. So they've exploded, and the outcome is that they're eating all the kelp forests off the coast of California. And kelp forests are, of course, extremely important for carbon sequestration. They They can sequester 20 times as much carbon as normal plants on land. And also they provide crucial kind of ecosystem service of providing habitat to other marine animals, kelp do. So yeah, these purple urchins have destroyed these kelp forests. 95% of the kelp forests off the coast of California have been destroyed. So Urchinomics, anyway, coming back to Urchinomics. So Urchinomics takes purple sea urchins, which are not traditionally the edible type of sea urchin. The red sea urchins are the edible ones. But what they've been doing is like they've been harvesting these purple sea urchins, ranching them. So they take them to these like human-made urchin ranches and fatten them up and are selling them to like these like high-end restaurants as like high-end urchins, which I think is like a really interesting like climate action tactic. Like using food like as an entry point for like dealing with carbon sequestration, like an economic, like novel kind of like mitigation tactic through our food system is like the signal.
Are they spray painting them green and stuff?
They're spray painting them red before serving them.
Oh, really?
No, I'm just joking. No.
Because it's very, someone told me recently, like most saffron that you can get is actually, it does come from Sri Lanka, but it's just some other bush and they color it red. It's not actually saffron.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've heard of this strategy quite a bit over the years around like invasive species in general of like just make it gourmet. It's interesting to see when it can be like effective and whether we'd actually want to be eating like weeds or whatever in the case of invasive species. But yeah, as a climate tactic, I mean, yeah, it's you got to adjust to your resources, I guess.
It's kind of a bet on the rapaciousness of like capitalist models of food production, right?
Yeah,
or harvesting.
That's a bet I'd make.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think the problem, I guess I shouldn't say the problem, the like potential problem with these sorts of models is always the, you know, like at what point are you incentivizing the thing? If it's cheaper to farm them or, you know, you end up harvesting them all and then there's still high demand, then you end up like creating, I don't know, like high density urchin farms that are then bad for the environment because most high density farming of any kind is not great for the environment. So like, it's always, at least in my mind, like a little tricky how you balance the incentive for the removal of these things versus the incentive for growing them.
What I find is interesting is just like the confidence that you have to have that you can drive demand for this thing. And like, where does that rationale come from in each of these cases? And is it like specific to this instance or is it something that can be like?
Well, the rationale is basically that urchins are a high demand gourmet food in general, but most people don't really know that it's not the purple urchins, it's the red urchins that people eat.
Why?
Why red urchins over purple?
Yeah.
Because they have more roe than the purple urchins. The purple urchins are skinny. And so that's why they're ranching them, right? So they take them and then they basically, it's like a garbage kind of mechanism for sea urchins, which is like the thing you do for foie gras, right? Like it's like force feeding these urchins.
Yeah, or like the difference between like grass-fed versus like grass-finished beef.
It's grass-finished urchins. Yeah.
What this sort of reminds me of also is the I don't know what you call it, like the luxurization of lobster in the 19th century. Was basically considered, you know, I mean, it's a bottom feeder. It's like an ocean spider, but like it was successfully turned into a luxury food item through the railroad system, and like seems to have remained there since then. So like maybe there is hope for urchin. And actually, Macy, with regards to what you were saying earlier, it seems like the fact, you know, the fact that's being marketed as a luxury item instead of like for everyone, like I personally like find that sort of ethically objectionable and like why does it have to be done that way? But that seems to be, and this is like it's like a difference in prescription versus description, but like generally it seems like getting people to adopt things, you have to start with high status individuals. Like to get something to catch on, you have to market it as a luxury item and then sort of like let it trickle down culturally. And it seems like, you know, and maybe this is an untested assumption, or like it is not actually totally justified, but like it seems like even people who are fairly, like dedicated to the cause, so to say, for like climate stuff or other sort of pro-social causes, feel like the most effective way is basically, like you get celebrities, you get rich people, you get high status elites to be into something because that is how you get everyone to pay attention to it. And like, you know, whether that's sort of like a myth that's propagated to justify, sort of like luxury commoditization, or whether it's actually like an effective strategy.
I think it's a cost-effective marketing strategy. because people who are like central nodes in the network, by spending a small amount of money marketing to them, you can use their centrality in the network to amplify the message, which is like the Tesla strategy too, right? Quality, high caliber cars that are going to appeal to a small number of people, and use that as like the growth strategy to build and get to a more accessible version of the car. It seems to have worked.
Signal or noise, Matthew?
I want to say signal, and not just because I think sea urchin is delicious, and this makes me feel like more ethically justified in eating it. But I think there's something to this, and I actually think the example of lobster shows that this is a method that has worked in the past, which like gives me a little bit of confidence about it.
Bothered?
I don't know, Rob, you expressed like hesitation around having seen lots of projects like this before, which I also have like, it's like a very common trope inside of like the food marketing machine and whatnot of like invasive species and whatnot. But I think inevitably, like, yeah, there's a signal here around like shifts in like what food supplies are going to have to be, how they're organized in order to cope with the, we've called sometimes like climate weirding, not just like climate warming as though it's a linear thing, but actually like a very non-linear process that accidentally warming here causes something else to happen over here, causes a drought there. These kinds of shifts that are much less predictable, and the kinds of ways that you'll have to adapt and just eat whatever gunky thing like is around. I think that's a signal of us getting, that's going to happen. And then the kinds of enterprise opportunities that will exist for these kinds of like climate crisis harnessing entrepreneurial opportunities. Yeah.
Macy,
yeah, it reminds me a little bit on the kind of like hopeful side of matsutake mushroom, and how it's like such a prized like commodity in Japan. It's like about surviving in like difficult conditions, and there's like a whole economy that's like now based on it, with people coming worldwide to like forage and harvest it and then sell it at really high prices because there is the market for it. But at its core, it is about having that awareness for this kind of like interspecies relationships, and like actually also respecting that in a sense as well. So maybe the hope for these urchins is that it could lead into that direction as opposed to like the more capitalistic direction.
Yeah, I feel like this might also be a strong argument for like a signal within just the changing mix of seafoods that we might be consuming, and like that just, even when you say seafood and are talking about that might change. And there's so much more talk about that since this Netflix documentary, but all of the sort of like injustices and just inefficiencies of fishing and shrimp and slavery that comes with it, and so many of these other issues have kind of come to light in a more mainstream way recently, that like, yeah, maybe how we think about seafood is going to completely change.
Well, what's the Netflix documentary?
It's called Seaspiracy.
Oh, right.
Wasn't there a film called Cowspiracy or something? Is it in the same?
I think that one's about like cows infiltrating our highest levels of government and private institutions. But I might be thinking of a different film.
It's funny, the Bolsheviks were known for wearing leather. That was like their calling card or whatever. They wore black leather. I never thought of it as like being dressed up as like cows. That's basically what they are.
Okay, Macy, what's
it's not cows. It's not reptiles. It's the cows.
It's the cows, not the reptiles. Okay.
I've been looking at these things, gathering materials to build what's called a yo-yo machine, or I guess it can be a series. So there are these like simple DIY network communication devices that you build it in pairs, so it connects across the internet for people to send each other nonverbal expressive signals using light, sound, movement, other things that are kind of these minimal expressive communication signals. So it's this interaction research studio from Goldsmith that's like putting out how to make them. And it builds off of years of research that's on systems that support peripheral and emotional awareness remotely. So there are different prototypes that you can make. There's one that's like called light touch. So it's about exchanging colored lights that sends a pulse to the other device, and it fades slowly so that you can use them in real time or leave traces for your partner or like whoever is on the other end to find later. There's this one called like Flutterby, which creates like a sense of presence. So it's kind of like if you're remote and you can be like working together or something, it picks up your movement, and the movement is shown by ambient movement. So like maybe feathers moving or something. So it can be seen, but it's not distracting. There's like a mood barometer where you can like have a pointer that indicates a feeling. There's also like a sound one where it's like you tap on a box and it's picked up by the other side. I was just interested in these very minimal, almost like implicit, very like mediated ways to find intimacy remotely. So I'm hoping to like make one.
I really like the crafty aesthetic. It's like very like kindergarten classroom kind of like materials looking.
Yeah, it's very like playful and just like easily accessible, I guess.
The way you describe it sounds much more inviting and accessible than like the sort of language around like Arduino and microcontroller stuff, which always seems like sort of very cold and engineering and like computational and sort of like, you know, all of the like technical intimidation, like engineering prowess stuff that comes up with that. So like in that sense, it sort of sounds, specifically even when you describe like the feather, I was like, I can't think of like a single Arduino type of project I have seen. Like sort of the prototypical one, like a feather has no place in that. And or it sort of feels like it has no place in that. So like, yeah, I sort of the vibe you are describing sounds like much more.
And also just thinking about nonverbal communication more. I guess it ties a little bit to like the first signal that we're talking about in terms of like sensing presence, even though we're far away or apart.
Is there an intrinsic way in this sort of protocol or the schemes here of knowing who sent the communication? Like, is it necessarily a one-to-one thing?
I guess in this case, it is a one-to-one thing, but yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if it could become more than a one-to-one pairing and a more networked experience.
Isn't there some haptic like ways of messaging on an iPhone?
Yeah, there's a way to send your heartbeat to somebody else.
That's cool.
Through text.
I like the idea of having these other kinds of devices, and also that they don't feel like devices in kind of the way that you were articulating, Matt, that it just feels very intimate or something.
Yeah, there's something very like sort of like romantic about the idea of like someone sending you like gently oscillating light and like a feather waving back and forth a little bit, like in a way that just like, you know, sending like a hello or like just checking in text, like it doesn't sort of convey it as like holistically.
I want a feathered hello. And also just like I feel like it's that peripheral awareness thing, because it's not very in your face. It's just like, oh, I'm noticing this now. Oh, someone's thinking of me.
Have they connected this to like COVID? Is that part of the framing? Which is
I
like
think that is part of the framing. I think it's
Okay.
like while people are apart, how can we think of ways to create intimacy or to communicate non-verbally?
Too much attack surface.
But I'm curious, like the name yo-yo implies, I get that it's like for two people, but it also makes me think of like games and things like this. Like, is there any element of like designing the sort of social protocols around this, like into games or into like different kinds of interactions? Can you combine different, are they called yo-yos or something? Like, do they have a name or something? Can you combine different machines to like make, I don't know, different kinds of like games?
I'm sure you can.
Yeah, I mean, it immediately reminded me of like this is an idea that I've talked to some of you about, which is the wireless rope idea, which is I want to see if you could do like a two-way haptic interaction over the internet using like what's called WebRTC, which is like a two-way web real-time protocol for communicating information, and have like essentially two servos on different parts of the world, each with a kind of pulley. And if you could replicate the feeling of pull and push through rope, so you could actually be tugging the same, feel like you're tugging the same string. So you feel like you're interacting with somebody through a piece of rope over the internet, which is an idea
Let's make it.
I've really wanted to make for years.
We gotta make it. Gotta make it, Udit.
Stop procrastinating and make your shit.
Signal and noise. Fathers?
Just for the sake of having agreed with all of them today, I'll say noise, just because I've seen quite similar projects. I do think it's cool, but I don't know that it says anything different from projects that are similar that I've seen before.
Matthew?
Honestly, like I just found something very evocative about it, and it like resonated emotionally with me. So I'm gonna say signal.
Udit?
It's a signal, I think.
I'd probably put this in the like hope it's a signal category. Sort of I've seen these types of signals for a long time, but it does feel like maybe we're at a moment where something could be different. Maybe that's because of a mix of things like people's literacy, the sort of like technical ease at which something like this can be done, and the demand for a different type of interaction all at once. I guess that puts it as more than just hope it's a signal, but signal. Matthew, in a new space, what's your weakest signal?
I saw this app that thought was sort of interesting, but yeah, like it was a weak signal for me. It's called NewNew. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. The way it's sold is that like it allows influencers to monetize their choices. And basically, when you are using it, you present viewers with options, and then they pay you. And I think votes are basically proportional to how much money is spent. And then you make the choice that got the most votes. So I think the basic idea is an influencer is streaming, their life or whatever. And they're like, oh, I have to, order a sandwich. What kind of sandwich should I get? Roast beef, turkey, ham, or tuna salad, vote for each option. And then I think, I don't quite know how the sort of money to choice function is structured, but basically it is a way that allows viewers to pay the people streaming and to make choices. Straight up, one of the taglines for the app is control my life. Yeah. And the way in which it's being publicized is some of it's standard, very standard, tech hype journalism. It's oh, this woman dropped out of high school to become Drake's manager, and now she, made it big and is transitioning into the tech game because she's, because you have to be a successful dropout with a vision for the future to be successful in tech. And this allows people to, sell their lives to other people on the internet. So there's definitely a lot of the traditional tech hype cycle aspects to it. Is this really meaningful, or is this just another sort of drop in the bucket of influencers are basically already selling themselves? They do what their fans want to see anyway. The sort of transactions implicit, and often it happens via some third party branding, or they're promoting something. Is this just the thing that already existed made explicit and finally crystallized in the way that everyone sort of saw themselves on social media anyway? Or is there something? It's
it seems like a deep desire to want to be robots. It's how can I become an actuator? And that's what's going on here. It's so funny that's I don't know. I was kind of referencing earlier this favorite Instagram meme account called Fuck It, I'm a Robot. That's just sort of all these instances of people signs that people follow that you really probably shouldn't or whatever. But it's really interesting, this idea. The first thing that came to mind when you said it, I was wondering what platform was OnlyFans, and I see that OnlyFans is one of the ones listed there, which is, I understand OnlyFans, that something like this is kind of built in a way, but maybe I don't know how it's different, but it's really interesting that Wattpad is there, because the idea that you'd be making creative decisions and having people vote on them is kind of cool.
Yeah, I'm curious, are there boundaries to parameters are being controlled, or what kind of decisions are people making? What
decisions are you not allowed to sell to the crowd?
Yeah. Another thing is so I wasn't able to check out the app at all because it's iOS only, and I do not have an iPhone. I assume there's no enforcement mechanism or sort of binding. If you don't make the decisions people pay you to make, your reputation is the way.
This is an example of a signal from an artist 2 decades ago. There was that guy who, and I don't remember his name, but he incorporated himself, and then he sold shares into his life for every decision, who he was going to date, whether he was going to go to university, what job he should take. And basically everybody who bought shares, based on how many shares they had that much of a vote in terms of determining what his life would be. And he would give out dividends every year. And he fully turned himself into a kind of over-identified form of human capital or something like this. It reminds me of that. It's not quite the same thing, because it's more content questions around what I should make and what I should create, and not life decisions, as far as I can see so far. So that doesn't reach as deeply as it seems the hype around it is claiming. It's not telling you to break up with your girlfriend, or to move back in with your mom, or to, quit your job. I don't know. Is that allowed? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. It's interesting because, what you're describing with regards to it being sort of more focused on content creation, it's interesting that I think that is probably the more practical use case, but that doesn't seem to be the way it's being marketed. It seems in their own marketing materials, they're pushing this turn a person into a democracy. It's well, one, it's not a democracy. It's it is actually the money that determines the outcome. But and also yes, thank you, plutocracy. It's very much the life choices. It's you can democratize your life choices, have other people pitch into making the decisions. There is something darkly appealing about wait a second, I don't have to make any tough decisions and I get money for it. Of course, that probably isn't the practical reality, but it does seem to be being angled as have control over someone's life, vote your choices with your dollars.
Democratizing the life coach.
Distributed life coach. Yeah, I was thinking that it's like, isn't this the opposite of what an influencer is? Like, isn't that, like, where does the influence happen at this point?
It's the
like you're
influenced,
influenced, right?
You're influenced, not an influencer. It's the opposite.
Yeah.
And almost like I feel like they need to already have had a following. So there are people who wants to contribute.
I mean, maybe you could develop a following by being like rigidly adherent to the app. Like you get famous for being the person that broadcasts every decision and like, follows it, has 100% compliance. And like you could have an identity having your right, being the conduit for other people's choices and sort of like complete fidelity with regards to the access of control to your life.
I do notice this behavior is something that's pretty common on social media now in a lot of ways, where people will just a question about a life decision, sometimes really trivial, sometimes more serious, and ask for people's input or put a poll or something like that out there. So it's like a little different, but that's like they're asking for that input and help, not like the idea that you would want to pay to do that is, yeah.
It's a very natural actually merger of two distinct like interactions that were happening on Twitch, right? Which is like you do these polls and there are like these Twitch tokens that you give to people and they've just combined them.
So it's like pretty brilliant. It's like market matching or whatever.
How are people going to use this as like a new form of kind of interactive media that has this like economic element and create like new kinds of like, or like new genres of like entertainment? Would there be like games that you can build on top of this, for example, which have like this economic component and you like incentivize people to do different things together? What if you have like two different people and they're like competing against something and like you have these two avatars that are competing against something and these are real people and there's like money behind it, whatever. It can get really dark, but I think there's like something interesting to think about, like where.
This is how people find entertainment these days.
Yeah, it's so funny. Fans who want agency matched with celebrities with no compass or.
Well, it's like LARPing, but with this economic component.
Is there a legal defense that eventually becomes like predicated on this app? Like, oh, my client was not acting of their own volition due to the nature of their sort of like profession and lifestyle. They were obligated to, adhere to the vote that was like cast on them, and without it they wouldn't have a livelihood, so expecting them to like exist in any other way is unreasonable.
Right, so as a defense to murder.
That's the sort of, if you play this out to its like most absurd conclusion, like someone following the like votes on this app with complete adherence, I feel like that's one place it ends up. But also I feel like I was saying, like, is this just a Twitch feature that is like just going through the like PR hype cycle?
There was something someone said earlier about this is almost like humans want to be automated in some way. And it just made me think of, there's a French thinker of technology, Simon Dunn, who like talking about how we think about automation and why the way that we frame it as though humans are being replaced doesn't make any sense. What actually occurred is that humans preemptive their own automatability through the kinds of organizations of work that we created. So we like, basically, if you go into the history of how like factory processes for different things like pottery and whatnot, like they were actually basically broken down into like very narrowly defined tasks before any machine emerged. And so it was the very way that work was organized that was already like preemptively automatable in the first place, that machines were able to take it over. And so it's not that machines take over our job, it's that we turned into them in the first place. And it made me think like, oh, is that what's happening here at some kind of identity level, at some kind of social level? People talk about communicative capital, like we're creating, much of social media, depends on people constantly producing communicative capital, like between each other, right? That's kind of their stock in trade of a certain kind. It's like, yeah, we were already automated, through Twitch and through other mechanisms of being influenced. And this is kind of just the formal moment when it gets kind of more subsumed or something like that. It's like a natural
that's the point
outgrowth
that Matt was making earlier, which is like, that's what influencers are doing anyway, right? This is just like a very explicit signaling of what to do.
It also reminds me that, so a few days ago, my partner saw this thread on Reddit where it was basically a video of this like food delivery worker who was left instructions in the like sort of special instructions part of the app to basically like dance and do, it's like, oh, touch your head, spin around, do all these things when delivering it, and like a sort of unsettlingly large number of people in the comment thread were sort of laughing about it. And there were like a few voices that were like, this is really messed up, this is exploitative, like this person can't not do this, like because of the power dynamics of this situation, like this is a really unethical and messed up thing to do. And everyone else, well, not like most of the people, like, oh, don't be a buzzkill, he's clearly enjoying it, this isn't a big deal, like it's a way to like lighten things up. And I feel like it, you know, in the way we normally think of sort of service workers as commodified labor, this is like that in its purest form. It's like, in that situation, like the Uber Eats was sort of like a circuitous mechanism to use money to basically have control over someone's behavior. And so this sort of cuts out the middleman, and it somehow like feels much more controversial and dehumanizing, but it's like, no, this is like basically what we're doing all the time, and people sometimes use those existing mechanisms, and I feel like to varying degrees, like do that all the time, you know, sort of like taking out your frustration on like a waiter, or, you know, like being like condescending to an employee in a like department store or something. Like those are ways in which people use money to express themselves and sort of use these power dynamics to express themselves and have control over other people's life and behavior. And this is sort of it distilled into its purest form. And so like, if really what you're going for is just using resources to control other people, you know, sort of industrialists get that at the highest scale. And then like, you know, the nature of sort of service interactions like democratizes this like unethical power dynamic to some extent. And now this really makes it like a fully distributed way of exploiting labor, money, and power dynamics.
There was a report by this Chinese research think tank called Chuang recently, which talked about like platform capitalism and the gig economy in China. They were talking about this explicit thing, which is like the extent to which these platforms can control gig workers and like the levels that they go to like obey the platform essentially. One of the examples that was there, which I thought was startling, was the food delivery. A lot of these food delivery apps have managed to cut down delivery times by half, 50% over the last 2 years in China. And one of the ways they do it is because they give instructions to go against traffic while delivering food. And these people, like the gig workers, obey it because it's the fastest way to travel, and they don't meet their like incentives if they don't. But it's crazy. It's increased like car accidents by a certain amount. It's like been like fatal. But because there is this like weird power dynamic, and you know, you feel like you're obeying the platform, and you feel like this sort of like responsibility to obey the platform, you know, it happens.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there are any mechanisms that the platform might implement to think about the safety of the users.
I want to hear the kind of darkest possible like liberal take on this. And by liberal, I mean like a classical liberal, you know, those who became like maybe neoliberal or whatever, who basically have a vision of markets actually pacifying human relationships. Like this is like a used to be like a very standard kind of like approach that markets are actually much better than political relationships, because political relationships are based on force, market relationships are based on something like a commercial interaction, and this somehow softens human interactions. And so I like this idea, like, could you make a very dark claim that actually like putting your own like personal life's most intimate choices to some market is actually like a much more humane way of organizing like your own life, that it could lead to some kind of like peaceful thing and not some horrifying torture scenario that so far it sounds like that's like the obvious place to go to. And it sounds like that's like what the company is like hyping up to in terms of like just its own marketing approach is like a very obvious route to take, I guess.
But I feel like the classical liberal take here would be you need that representation in the market from like the actual human too, because that's like the voice that doesn't have a stake in this market. If you want to create a market that's balanced, where you want to protect the rights of the individual being influenced also, you have to have their voice in the market in some way. So who's representing that voice? Yeah. So either you need to have that person also interacting or having a kind of like role in the market, or somebody acting on their behalf, which I don't know if you have. Otherwise, you're going to create some sort of externality.
I think the standard reply here is that it is their choice to offer the choices to the audience. Right. So they could just choose not to do that. You know, I mean, I feel like a lot of the sort of like traditional liberal notions of the perfection of markets are predicated on of basically coercion not existing, like coercion not being a thing. So yeah, I feel like it probably fails in practice along that line pretty quickly.
And symmetry of information, which in this case is like explicitly not there because you cannot see inside this person's mind.
Well, maybe that could be like the game. There could be a player that's the advocate for the influencer that thinks about what the influencer might want, that's countering other requests that might harm the influencer.
The empath.
I mean, it's cool, I think, if you're actually down to like the decision, it could go either way. I don't know. Sometimes like with a lot of these types of things, like really as soon as you frame the question, you know the answer. And like I guess that's kind of cycles back to what Bob said earlier about problems and solutions. But if we were to say that like this was a way to actually get a better creative decision made in some creative process. And I think life decisions are similar.
It is making a market out of personal decisions.
Yeah. Are they all binary decisions or like?
I don't know. The sort of mock-ups or like screenshots I saw, it seemed like sort of a multiple choice like poll.
So I guess there is some agency in the influencer's part.
The name NewNew makes me feel very suspicious about it, that like this was sort of like Michael Lewis NewNew thing. And this was like the perfect answer to like this cultural moment to that question. Like,
it's not a very good name. It doesn't tell me what it is at all.
Because they probably existed before the product.
Oh yeah,
is what I'm getting at.
They pivoted like into this.
It's a new version of it.
Founders, investors, and then like whatever. Yeah.
I mean, I also sort of wonder if like all of the other names they came up with just were like sounded way too dark because they convey the idea of the thing.
Yeah, right. Robo person. It can get darker. Yeah. There's no chance that this is like a design fiction or something. It's real.
I think it's actually a really good example of like the kind of thing that like you have to take seriously in all of its like farcicalness and like contradictions and whatnot. Like despite this to me being a future that I'm not invested in, like I'm not interested in extending markets to every possible decision. Like I don't think that's the best mechanism for much of human life. And like I think it's very likely, or very possible rather, that you could see things like this because the kinds of financial tools and the kinds of social influencing tools, it's all there. It's all already there. There's no reason that you can't make it happen. And so the kinds of futures that this example holds, whether or not it's just, you know, the product of a VC hype machine, which is probably, I would give it like a 75% chance that that's what this is, or if it's like a possible signal of like a real future. I think it's like, yeah, I think it's both at the same time. And it should be taken seriously for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. It's a signal towards a future I hope would not become reality.
Yeah, I agree so.
I was hoping that one of you would make your determination based on what your viewers paid you to choose. I think that's the only thematically appropriate decision here.
Should we leave it and just let the viewers, whoever make it this long, to decide?
You decide.
Yeah, so much of like new models of commerce and currency and the economics, I had just like reveal so much about the history of these things. You just notice what we weren't noticing but was in plain sight. It's a really interesting aspect of these things. Broadcast from later.